see why it is that I'm supposed to deal with history to start with. Sounds like I've had most of the history of transportation in my career. I'm going to return us for a moment to the topics that we're supposed to be covering today and tell you that this set of concerns, interrelated policies and so forth, daunts me. It's a little bit hard to say how one can cover all those matters, so obviously I'll narrow myself a bit. What I'm going to narrow myself to is primarily the transportation finance side, although I'm going to start with a little bit of information about why we should care about transportation and a little bit of information about what transportation does before I get into finance. The key reason that I'm concentrating on finance is that if one asks, looking into the future, whether transportation is sustainable in this society or others, one has to ask, is it financially sustainable? My unfortunate response to that, to give away the whole story, is probably not. But that doesn't mean things can't be done. So why do we care about transportation? First, a lot of people work in transportation, no question about that. There are over 13 million workers in the transportation field in the U.S. It's an important part of the gross domestic product, around $1.3 trillion in terms of the generation of services by transportation. And for you and me, it's a big part of what we spend. Around 17% of the average household expenditure is made for transportation purposes. In terms of those jobs, one of the interesting things is that the number of jobs in transportation has been relatively static for quite a period of time. Here's information for roughly the last 20 years. And over that period of time, we have approximately the same size workforce. One of the things to take from that is that transportation has become surprisingly productive. The most productive industry measured in terms of labor productivity in the United States over the last 20 years has been the railroad industry. Rather interesting for a staid and really very old industry in this country. In terms of the economy, I've got some charts here from something that is produced by the Bureau of Transportation Statistics. It's an annual fact book. This is for 2010. I'm sure you can't see much of anything there. But what it suggests is the size of the GDP in the transportation sector versus other areas on the left, and the household expenditures on the right. I'll take this to you in tabular form and show you some information about the percentage expenditures that you and I make as a household in this country. Housing is the biggest. Healthcare is important. But rather surprisingly, this is the gross domestic product. And in the case of gross domestic product, housing is the most important area. Healthcare, the area that we've been spending so much time on in the Congress in the last year or so, is essentially second most important, and then it goes down to a variety of other areas. But transportation is the fourth most. It's about 10% of the gross domestic product. What we spend, though, is rather interesting in that if you look at healthcare, about 6% of our expenditures are made on healthcare. It's no longer that large a part of the total budget for a family. We find that housing is the most important expenditure. Housing and transportation are very closely intertwined, and that transportation, with around $8,600 worth of expenditure for the average household, is in second place among all the things that we put money into. Now, what do we put money into in the transportation field? Should be clear that it's primarily in vehicles. Vehicle purchases, gasoline, other vehicle expenditures, and so forth. Public transportation expenditures are virtually zero in comparison. Only about $500 of those $8,000, and of those, it's primarily airline fares. So having suggested that transportation is important in economic terms, transportation is also very important in non-market terms, in terms of externalities. We think of transportation as having lots of externalities of the negative sort: air pollution, noise pollution, water pollution, visual pollution, and so forth. One of the interesting things to note is that there are also positive externalities accruing from transportation, both in terms of those who produce on the side of factories and distribution systems and the like, and also for you and I, in terms of having access to many more opportunities than would exist without reasonable transportation systems. One of the things to note, and I think this is perhaps surprising to told us that many of these negative externalities have become somewhat better in the past decade or two. We have a safer transportation system than was once the case. We have less in the way of air pollution than was once the case. Some of those safety changes are also reflected in the Bureau of Transportation Statistics publication. I don't expect you to see that very well, but it shows that the primary problem with regard to safety in terms of deaths, injuries, property damage happens to be in the highway mode, and most of the other modes have very little in the way of safety difficulties. In terms of modal safety, however, one of the very interesting things to note is that virtually every form of transportation has been getting better and better over the last several decades. In terms of air pollution, you'll note a number of different types of criteria pollutants which are trending down as time goes on. There's various lines going from your left to your right. The only one that is trending up is that of ammonia. In most instances, things are getting rather decidedly better. There are measurement stations all around the country that relay this kind of information. Cedar Rapids, for example, has air pollution measurement, and that's where this information comes from. One of the positive externalities that we think about probably too little is the way in which households now have access to transportation and access to mobility. And one of the criteria for that, one of the measures, is the extent to which households have a vehicle available to them. And what this suggests is that the households, in terms of motor vehicles, there are fewer than 10% of the households in the country without access to a motor vehicle. Well, this tells you something about where transportation is, tells you not terribly much about where transportation is going. The question you might have, though, is what role is played by the government in bringing about any sort of change in transportation? I'm going to take you through some of the history of changes that have occurred, some of the roles the government has played. Let me suggest first that there are several things the government can do. The government can own and operate transportation. Many transportation systems today are owned and operated by government entities. For example, Iowa City Transit. The government can finance transportation, can tax it, can subsidize it, can impact its output by means of the financial mechanisms that are used. The government can regulate transportation. This country has a long history of regulating the economic effects of transportation and a more recent history of regulating the environmental and safety impacts of transportation. Finally, a government might use moral suasion. That's perhaps the weakest form of bringing about change, but it's certainly something the government's put into effect. The first role that this national government took was in conjunction with what was a very small country clustered around the East Coast ports, and a country that had great expansion possibilities and major expansion plans. The U.S. had its first major transportation policy activity take place when Secretary of the Treasury Gallatin in 1808 produced a plan. The plan that Secretary Gallatin produced was one that suggested that there should be quite a system, quite a network of canals and wagon roads, that the country would never become a consolidated nation without that kind of expansion. Gallatin's plan was never put into effect. It essentially disappeared into history, although elements of what was suggested in the form of a nationwide network rose from time to time throughout the history of the country. The first activity that actually put in place some federal money and some federal purpose was a road. The Cumberland Road, or the National Pike as it was sometimes called, started construction in 1811 and kept being constructed from the east to the west, as far as Illinois, and did so until money ran out of common thread in transportation in 1839. Another major effort of the federal government was related to the Gallatin Plan in terms of the Erie Canal, which was started up in 1825. There were various other activities, the River and Harbors Act of 1823, But probably the most important other role of the federal government was not an expenditure role per se, but a use of the federal government's resources to provide land grants to railroads. From 1850 to 1871, the federal government provided land with the purpose of stimulating railroad construction, railroad development, and expecting that farm development and westward expansion would follow. The railroads built some 18,700 miles of road, and they received about 175 million acres of public land. Doesn't make much sense to most of us, unless you think that that was about a tenth of the entire United States and larger than the state of Texas. The expanding of the country by the Union Pacific in 1869 occurred with government support and government issued bonds. But by and large, after the 1860s, the federal government was not involved in land grants to any extent and was quiescent as far as transportation activity. That is until a new role of the government came into play with the Act Regulating Commerce of 1887. That act was a turning point in many respects as far as government policy towards transportation, but it was not necessarily an act that attempted to expand transportation opportunities or improve the situation as far as transportation. Rather, it was an act that was sponsored by the Ranger states, which included Iowa, Illinois, and a variety of other western states, in an attempt to curb the power of railroads to set rates and to bring about monopoly actions. The Hepburn Act of 1906 followed that, and a series of other ones that probably wouldn't be much interested in did. The Hepburn Act brought pipelines under federal government regulation, under the Interstate Commerce Commission. Other acts proceeded in regulation of economic activity of railroads and of motor carriers, and air carriers, and inland waterways essentially was complete by the time of the Transportation Act of 1940. And that kind of regulatory control continued until the late 1970s. In 1977, air freight transportation was deregulated. In 1978, air passenger transportation likewise. And then in 1980, a Motor Carrier Act and a Hepburn Railroad Act were both passed, which deregulated most of the economic activities of our freight and passenger carriers. So regulation was something that was extremely strong for about almost 90 years or so. The Interstate Commerce Commission achieved its 100th birthday before it went out of existence, and that was the policy of the country to control the forms of transportation, not to own and operate them, not to subsidize them, but to control their economic activities. However, in that vein, there were other activities that the federal government dipped its toe into. And one of those activities was to start financing something other than just the Cumberland Road and to start attempting to essentially get the farmer out of the mud. And more importantly, at the time of the first highway acts to finance highways took place in this country, there was a lot of pressure from bicycle interests to try and provide hard surface roads for bicycle purposes. There was a small Office of Road Inquiry produced in 1893. There was a Federal Highway Act of 1916. There was the establishment of the Bureau of Public Roads, which was headed by an Iowan who earlier than that had been in charge of the highway activity in Iowa, state of Iowa. And a couple of concepts came out that were, I think, rather important and we're pointing out because they've continued to the current day. One of those was the concept of having users finance highways rather than having the general revenue of the country finance highways. So that if you benefited by having a highway, it was assumed that you would pay somebody for that benefit. The other was that highway monies that were generated that way, those revenues were placed in what were called trust funds. And the idea was that you would spend those monies on the purpose for which the trust fund was established. So if you have a highway trust fund, a road trust fund, and you charge people to use the highways, then you would take the proceeds and put them into highway construction and highway activities. In the earliest days, the money that was generated came from state and localities to some extent, not from the federal government. But in 1934, there was a Revenue Act of 1934, in the worst days of the Depression, which raised money by means of placing a 1-cent gasoline tax on gallons of fuel that were produced. This was a wholesale excise tax. The money was to go to offset the deficit, and only later did those funds go into the National Highway Trust Fund. There was an extension of revenue activities that I'll go into in just a moment for quite a period of time, but it was stimulated by the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, which essentially established the interstate highway system in this country, which continues to be an important focus for highway purposes. This little piece shows you something from an Iowa DOT publication that just came out a little while ago about the history of roads, and I don't know if you can see this very well, but here's somebody stuck in the mud, and the road activity that took place in the 1900, 1920, 1930 period faced exactly this sort of problem with regard to the users of the country. There were trucks in the earliest days. This is from the 1920s period, but all of them were facing very inadequate facilities. Not only inadequate facilities, but pretty darn unsafe ones. This is a little piece from 1916, the numbers of people killed, and many of these were running into trains in one respect or another. And the question was, will this knock Iowans into trying to be a little bit safer? Unfortunately, it didn't, but by this time, with the exception of using your text messaging, we're getting a little bit safer. I mentioned that there has been a history of user fee finance in highway transportation. It was a penny in 1934. In that 1956 period, it went up to 3 cents, up by half cents and cent improvements prior to that. By 1959, it went to 4 cents. In 1984, 9 cents per gallon, with a penny of that increase took place for transit, 9.1 cents in 1987. And then, interestingly enough, the last increase was to 18.4 cents in 1993. Since that time, there's been no increase in federal gasoline taxes, user fees. There have been increases around the country, but relatively minor ones in state user fees. State fees at this point are generally a bit higher, it's about 20.5 cents for the average state compared to the 18.4 cents. You might wonder about those strange amounts, the 9.1, for example, went from 9 to 9.1, so underground storage tanks to be removed at gasoline stations, so an attempt to account for externality. The gas tax is not the only source of revenue, obviously, for highway purposes. There are lots of other ones. The trucks pay heavy vehicle use taxes, $500 or so for a full-size vehicle. There's a diesel differential, if you've ever heard of that. And the diesel users pay more per gallon of diesel consumed because the diesel engine is more efficient and you get more miles per gallon out of the diesel engine. And there are truck tire fees, automobile registration fees, driver license fees, and the like. Well, the major source is taxing fuel, and there's fuel tax breaks rather interestingly now for 17 years at the federal level have remained static. Has everything else remained static? No, not at all. In particular, we've had very large increases in the cost of maintaining and the cost of constructing highways in that interim period. What about the transit side? I'm going to delve into that just for a moment because obviously, from what I showed you a moment ago, the transit and highways are very closely linked in that user fees paid by highway users fund a good portion of the cost of transit activity, at least from the federal transit fund. We have the Urban Mass Transportation Act of 1964, and one of the interesting things about that was that it was an attempt to control and provide policy direction for the transit side of the country by making funds available to transit operations, transit agencies that were under local governmental control. Prior to 1964, the great bulk of the agencies in the country were private ones. Iowa City had a privately operated bus system, for example, prior to that time. The country used these excise fees from gasoline, and also used money from the general treasury to provide first capital grants to replace the systems that were in dire straits, and to improve the bus facilities, rail facilities in the country, and then started providing formula grants and operating cost support for transit. Well, ownership and operation would be another means of control that government might have over transportation, and this has been relatively minor in this country, although not in other countries. Transit, as I mentioned, is under local government control. We've had some nationalized circumstances with the railroads. In 1917, all the railroads were put under the control of the Army, and as a temporary emergency measure. The 1976 to 87 period saw 6 bankrupt Northeast railroads buying into a federal railroad operating company called Conrail. Amtrak in 1971 started its operation providing rail passenger service by the government and a variety of other activities along those lines. As far as roads, it might be interesting to note that the federal government is a very minor player in owning and operating roads, solely involved in institution roads, national park roads, military roads, and the like. The interstate system that you see all around you is owned and operated by the states. Today's highways are really quite extensive. We've got almost 47,000 miles of interstate system and 116,000 miles of other major highways and almost 4 million miles of other roads. One of the interesting things to note is that if you look at the geography of roads, that 4 million miles is roughly similar to what we had, say, in 1950. There hasn't been too much of an expansion of the road network. The expansion has come in terms of the quality of the roads. It's come in terms of the number of lane miles, not the number of miles of the road. Today's highways, though, extensive as they might be, funded as they might be by users and the like, receive a terrible grade. And what I'm using to illustrate this is the American Society of Civil Engineers and their most recent scorecard for 2009 for the road system of the country was a D-. Why? Well, read the language here, a lot of congestion, a lot of cost of that congestion, $700 per motorist. We have road conditions influencing safety, unfortunately, and we have a lot of repair costs. I'm sure that if you think about it, you may want to realign your wheels after this winter's potholes. We find that the spending level of user fees, spending level that includes expenditures made by cities on their local streets, the expenditures made from state coffers, are coming nowhere near the level of expenditures necessary to improve the highway system. The country has had a couple of recent missions that have studied the question of whether we have enough funding and what kind of funding we should have for transportation. One of these, with its report out in 2008, suggested that the gap is somewhere in the range of $100, $200 million or so over, depends on what period you look at. And even at the lowest ends of their estimates of simply keeping the highway system roughly in its current condition, the funds paid, the money generated by highway users comes nowhere close to meeting that gap. Transit actually is a little bit better, according to the engineers, than highways with a grade of D. Not that anyone necessarily wants a grade of D, but there has been some increased use of transit recently and some increased expenditure on transit. That takes us perhaps to the very current day, when if you read the newspapers, you'll know that all across the country, transit systems are reducing their services and raising their fares. In the current situation where most transit is funded with a large contribution from the local city or the local or the state in which it operates, those funds are short. And so the need for transit to change from a D to maybe a C- is unfortunately quite great. A study by by APTA, the American Association by several different of these associations in the area, suggested that transit is going to have a very large increase in expenditure, again, just to keep the transit system in reasonable condition. So, are we financially sustainable in the United States as far as our transportation system goes? We have declining revenues, especially with more fuel-efficient cars. We have a depletion of trust funds. We have unfortunate effects of congestion. We have problems with our freight system and supply chains. The country, I think one would have to say, does not today have a financially sustainable transportation system, either on the highway side or on the transit side. Are there solutions? Well, of course, one solution that has been tried but never really gotten anywhere is to raise user fees. Why is it that gasoline costs, say, $12 a gallon in Europe and less than $4 a gallon in the United States? Is there a different international price for oil? No, not at all. User fees are quite different. Raising them, though, in the United States has been very difficult sort of thing. Is it possible to try new sources of user fees, tap new mechanisms? Some of those possibilities that have been suggested are to use a congestion price and to charge those who want to use facilities in a congested period, to influence demand on those congested facilities and also to raise money. Perhaps use a EMT tax, a fee that would be based on the vehicle miles of travel and could be fine-tuned in a variety of ways. Some have suggested that, all these problems with transit and the highways, we really ought to privatize it and let firms decide what to do. This was Chicago's direction with the Chicago Skyway, Indiana's direction with the Indiana toll roads. It so far has not proven to be very effective. Are we inefficient in our highway transit operations? Can we reform them, economize them? Well, perhaps. But will that make much of a dent? The answer is no. Is a solution to expect suffering and problems and diminution of the transportation networks and operations and services in the country? I'm afraid so in the near future. In the longer distant future, there are certainly answers that can be put in place. Whether those are viable politically, whether they are viable in terms of the changes necessary to be made, the lifestyle of each and every one of us is a major question. The answer primarily is to densify our settlement patterns and to do away with the post-World War II suburbanization of housing and activities. Promote other forms of transportation and have fewer externalities. Use whatever carrots and sticks might be available to try and make a difference in the direction of transportation. Very interesting article by Dan Sperling, actually in the environmental movement, came out just about a year or two ago about the worldwide situation with 2 billion cars, and the question is whether anything that goes on in transportation worldwide is really sustainable given the pressures that exist today to utilize the automobile. So, is there anything that can be done in a real form? It seems to me that one has to look at the timeline for change. Incremental change is possible, but major change is going to take a very long period of time. How long did it take to become a suburbanized nation? How long did it take to become an auto-dependent nation? It would take at least as long to change in the opposite direction. And that change brings with it major resource cost, and it brings with it major impacts on various groups within the society. Politically, it is hard to believe that the country is willing to get away from its use of the automobile and move in the direction of other forms of transportation, or diminish the role of transportation in the entire society and the economy. Therefore, it seems to me that incremental changes can be made. Some of the incremental changes would utilize the tools the government has of finance and regulation, government ownership, moral suasion, planning. Maybe one of the most important possible tools is stimulation of more technological change in the transportation world. But in the short run, I think we have a system that is financially sustainable.
Yeah.